Hello and welcome. We now begin another unit, as you can see on the screen, entitled New Worlds, the Americas and Oceania. And before we dig into this, let me say that unlike most units where my PowerPoint lectures are not coordinated with the textbook, there's a lot of overlapping material. In this one, it pretty much is organized straight out of the textbook. A lot of the titles of slides come from subheadings in the chapter with this title, and more or less in the same order. There are a few places where that's not true, but most of that is true. It won't be true all the time, but it is in this particular lecture. On the screen, the picture we see also in our textbook, and the authors used this famous picture of Donna Marina, or La Malinche, famous or infamous in history, to sort of use her as a symbol of the many difficulties that Native Americans encountered when having to deal with the first arrival of Europeans. Bentley and Ziegler themselves say, quote, precisely because of her pivotal role in aiding Cortez and forwarding his invasion of the Aztec Empire, Dona Marina earned another name commonly bestowed on her in Mexican history, La Malinche, or the traitor. The belief that she betrayed her people by collaborating with the Spanish underscored how Native Americans faced many challenges and conflicts in their encounters with Europeans. So she did cooperate and collaborate with the Spanish who were invading, and she was of Native American descent herself. However, she wasn't an Aztec, and as we'll see, the Aztecs had lots of Native American enemies who were their neighbors. Nonetheless, you can see how, given the way the history went, that even to this day she would be considered a traitor and sort of a symbol of all that was wrong with European colonialism. She's also used as a symbol by the authors to show that Native Americans had oftentimes no good choices, sometimes no choice at all, but oftentimes few to no good choices. And one strategy among groups and among individuals sometimes was collaboration with Native Americans, trying to cooperate with them, but that had its downside, although it had an upside too. But it could be a risky and questionable strategy from the perspective of Native Americans, at least from a moral perspective, if not others. Colliding worlds, the Spanish Caribbean. When Columbus first accidentally tripped over North and South America, he hit the Bahamas first, just by accident. Good luck for him. He happened to run into a vacation resort place, checked into a hotel immediately, went snorkeling that same. No, sorry, I'm not trying to make light of this, but it is interesting that he landed in the Bahamas. And the Spanish, who went on to carve out a gigantic empire in North, Central, and South America. You can see part of in yellow. That's the Central American part of it for the most part. But it started in the islands of the Caribbean. From the Bahamas, the Spanish branched out. Columbus did as well. He took 4 voyages to the New World, but other Spanish explorers and then European voyages after that explored and conquered all of the islands of the Caribbean. The big ones being Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica. So the first colonial presence that the Spanish laid down was in the Caribbean islands, and they used that then as kind of a jumping off point to eventually, over time, move aggressively into North, Central, and South America. So this was kind of the entering wedge in their role or their takeover of Caribbean indigenous peoples' lands. And the first group of all to encounter Europeans, meaning Columbus, were the Taino Indians of the Bahamas and other islands around them. Our text says the Taino were the most prominent people in the region. They cultivated manioc and other crops, which means they were farmers. They were doing agriculture, and they lived in small villages under the authority of chiefs who allocated land to families and supervised community affairs. So they were already practicing an urban lifestyle, urban agricultural lifestyle, which is a more complex one than the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that some Native Americans had practiced for a long time, and some still did upon arrival of Europeans. They showed interest in the glass, beads, and metal tools that Spanish mariners brought as trade goods and offered little initial resistance to the visitors. So this would be in many ways, a problem for Native Americans going forward, is that basically in every part of Native America, whatever tribe or group we're talking about, north or south, they always were interested in European manufactured goods, pots, pans, it says glass, metal, beads, guns, etc., because they found them quite useful. So one of the reasons Europeans weren't, always 100% of the time, pushed out, or there was an attempt to push them out militarily, is because sometimes the Native American group in the area liked the trade goods and wanted to, engage in trade. The Europeans might have not been able to colonize successfully, had there been just opposition 100% of the time to their presence there in the form of violence, trying to push them back into the ocean. But this group was particularly, the Taino that is, peaceful. That's not true of all parts of Native America, and I think this certainly has something to do with the Taino living on this island and other islands in the area. I don't know if the other Taino groups were as peaceful as this one, but Columbus writes about this in his own journal or diary that he wrote right then and there. Like that night, that they were kind and welcoming, and they brought gifts, and they couldn't have been more hospitable. They were just very nice people. But in that same journal entry, he went on to say the following, which you see in blue at the top part of the screen: with 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do what we want. So he's saying these people, in so many words, Columbus is saying these people are so nice, we could roll them, roll over the top of them with just like 50 people. And that's what we're going to do. And it's pretty much what they did do. The Spanish weren't just there. Columbus wasn't just there to make money and profit. They had serious intentions of converting, at least after they discovered them, living there, to convert them to Christianity. You see a cross there in the painting. They were serious about it, however misguided it might have been. But certainly a primary reason for Europeans to be there and to keep coming was profits and the power that comes with control of land and resources. Bentley again telling us that the settlers, meaning the Spanish, first attempted to support their society by mining gold. Spanish settlers, however, were too few in number to mine gold, and in any case, they were not inclined to perform heavy physical labor. So the miners came largely from the ranks of the Taino. Conscription of Taino labor was a brutal business. Encomenderos means kind of like the bosses or employers, were the Spanish, landowners that took and stole the land from the Tainos, worked their charges hard and punished them severely when they did not deliver the expected quantities of gold or work sufficiently hard in the fields. That's actually an understatement. This ended up becoming really enslavement of Native Americans among the Tainos. By about 1515, social disruption and physical abuse had brought decline to the Taino population on the large Caribbean islands, especially Hispaniola, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Cuba, once again. They really went extinct. So Bentley and Ziegler aren't usually prone to understating things, but this is actually an understatement. It was worse than this makes it sound, and it sounds bad enough as it is. We'll learn about the encomenderos more as we go along here. You probably already know that one of the big and certainly the biggest problem that Native Americans encountered by far from the arrival of Europeans and what it did to their societies and cultures was the introduction of European diseases brought from Europe that were indigenous to Europe but had never been known in the Americas. And some of these diseases, like smallpox, kind of the most terrifying and devastating of all, had hit Europeans for years. But Europeans had developed immunity to them because they'd been dealing with it for hundreds or thousands of years. And that's the difference, because Native Americans were encountering these diseases for the first time when Europeans arrived, and right from the beginning of when they arrived, and it wiped out populations that had no immunity built up because they'd never seen the diseases. Why? Because just by luck of the draw, in the Americas, there were very few, there are now, there are very few domesticable animals. And in Europe, there was the full panoply of domesticable creatures. Goats, pigs, sheep, chickens, cattle, and on and on. None of those existed in the Americas. Well, why does that matter? Because a great deal of our illnesses and diseases come from animals, illnesses that are transferred from animals to people. Even the cold and flu come from animals. So if you don't have any of those animals, you don't have any of those illnesses and diseases. And they didn't. That's not to say there is no illness and disease in Native America, but they didn't get any of the huge number of diseases that come by being transferred from animals. So from a book called Patterns of World History, another good text on this subject, the author says the old world disease of smallpox quickly wiped out the estimated 250 to 1 million Tainos. The estimates vary. We don't have a clear picture of how many Tainos existed at the time of the arrival of Europeans and Spanish. Isolated for more than 10,000 years from the rest of humankind, Native Americans lived in the Americas by themselves for that long. Native Americans possessed no immunity against smallpox and were similarly ravaged by other introduced diseases such as measles, diphtheria, mumps, plague, influenza, typhoid, malaria, and yellow fever. The last of those on the list there, by the way, came from Africa. Once Europeans started to capture Africans and bring them by force, coercively, to the Americas to perform slave labor, they also had diseases that Native Americans had never encountered before, and so they had the same problem with not having immunity built up. So Native Americans got hit by, it's the Europeans' fault in both cases, but they got hit by diseases coming from two different parts of the world, whose diseases they'd never had to deal with before. And it wreaked havoc on such all Native American cultures everywhere. From mining to plantation agriculture, as our text lays it out for us, and says, after the mid-16th century, just a few decades into Spanish incursion into the Caribbean, when Spanish explorers located exceptionally rich sources of silver in Mexico and Peru, and that they did, the Caribbean became a sleepy backwater of the Spanish Empire. However, it became clear that if the Caribbean islands lacked precious metals, they offered ideal conditions for the cultivation of cash crops, particularly sugar, which would fetch high prices in European markets. Later, tobacco also became a prime cash crop of the region. And because by that time the indigenous populations were extinct, planters lacked the labor they needed to operate their estates, so they started importing several million slaves, or did import several million. Not immediately, but over time it ended up being several million. So the Europeans devastated two different peoples, Native Americans, through diseases and enslavement and overwork and warfare, and then another one when Native American populations were depleted to the point where they couldn't even field enough workers, even by force. Europeans then started to bring slaves from Africa. So all of this, of course, is enormously cruel, to put it mildly. Colliding worlds, the conquest of Mexico and Peru. So these are the first moves by Spain, Spanish conquerors, soldiers, or conquistadors, as they're sometimes called, from the Caribbean islands, where the Spanish had sort of cemented themselves, to the mainland of North Central South America. Mexico and Peru ended up being places where fabulous empires, spectacular empires, the Aztec Empire in Mexico, the Inca Empire in Peru, existed. And when the Spanish learned about them, just like Columbus had desired to take advantage of the Tainos, the officers, conquistadors, Cortez and Pizarro, one after the other, desired to take down these fabulous empires, mainly to take all of the wealth and resources into their own hands. Von Sivers, whose book I've already quoted, writes, "The Spanish conquerors of the Aztec and Inca empires, although small in number, succeeded by exploiting internal weaknesses in the empires. They swiftly eliminated the top of the power structures, paralyzing the decision-making apparatuses long enough for the conquest to succeed." A fancy way of saying they came in and tried to basically decapitate the kings or emperors of these empires. Not literally decapitate, but capturing them, eventually executing one of them. One of them got killed by his own people, and the chaos that ensued. But this was part of the strategy. Take out it's kind of the cut the head off the snake strategy. Cut the head off, and there's sort of no ability to kind of coordinate leadership downward in kind of a pyramid scheme. Military operations especially have to be top down for them to be able to really work. So, but we'll see there are other and even some more important reasons to explain how Spanish troops, who were actually pretty few in number, in the hundreds, were able to take down these two sprawling, gigantic, wealthy, impressive empires in every way. More on that. So first, the spectacular Aztec Empire and culture. I don't know why my font and the color has changed there, but it does stand out. So the Aztec culture and empire had been around for some time and was the dominant force in central Mexico and really kind of Mexico as a whole. Its capital city at Tenochtitlan was this huge city with very impressive architecture, monumental architecture, temples, palaces for the emperor and nobles. It was on an island, you can see in the upper right, and there were huge causeways built, like sort of like Bay Bridge type things, several of them, allowing people to come in and out of the city. All of this dazzled the Europeans who had seen big cities in Europe and couldn't believe what they were seeing, and couldn't believe it in part because of racism. They came in believing that they were superior to Native Americans, the indigenous populations in these regions, and others. And so then were probably extra shocked when they saw such impressive civilizations. By the way, strange, racism never makes any sense anyway, but it didn't change their minds about their own superiority and the inferiority of native peoples, even after they saw the wonders of Aztec life and civilization. Nonetheless, they were impressed, even if it didn't change their minds. It probably should have immediately. Tenochtitlan, the capital, dazzled its invaders. One well-known anthropologist says in his book, it was bigger than Paris. The Spaniards gawped like yokels at the wide streets, ornately carved buildings, and markets bright with goods from hundreds of miles away. Boats flitted like butterflies around three grand causeways. Long aqueducts conveyed water from distant mountains, and on and on and on. The marketplace, as one of Columbus's own officers wrote in his journal, that the marketplace seems to go on and on forever, and you could buy like anything you could think of to buy was on sale there. Now, of course, he was exaggerating because he couldn't have seen everything that was there, but it sounded like what he's saying. This is the most impressive marketplace I've ever seen anywhere that I've been in the world, and he'd probably been, again, to many of the great European trading centers. So this was a spectacular prize of an empire, to be sure. And you can see how greed among the conquistadors, the Spanish conquerors, and greed was, aplenty. It was in some ways a prerequisite for wanting to even go there, come to the New World at all. They started to rub their hands together, Europeans, when they learned of these kind of things. And it was a guy called Hernan Cortez, a young Spanish officer stationed on the island of Cuba, who first sort of heard rumors, mainly from Native American stories, about this gigantic empire that dominated, the area, that was teeming with wealth and was, mighty and powerful. And he didn't know if the rumors were true, but he just was bound and determined to find out. And kind of without permission, he got a force of hundreds of Spanish troops together and enough ships to transport them to the west. West from Cuba is across the Gulf of Mexico, and if you keep going west, you're on into the east coast of Mexico. And so that's where he heard that this empire was, but at first it was just rumors. It could have been a lie. And in fact, there were other rumors that come later on in the history of this Spanish Empire in the Americas that ended up not being true. And some conquistadors went on wild goose chases far afield, only to find that the supposed empire wasn't there. But in the first two instances where this happened, both in Cortez and what he learned about the Aztec Empire, and following that, Francisco Pizarro, and we learned about the Inca Empire, ended up being true. So the Spanish, in some ways, were kind of unlucky that both of the first two stories about these gigantic, wealthy, fabulous, spectacular empires were true. It was misleading, because then all the other ones were more likely to be believed. If one of these first two had been a success from the Spanish point of view and been true, and the other one was false, they would have had from the beginning a more realistic appraisal. Okay, sometimes these stories are true, sometimes they're not. But as things turned out, the first two ended up being true, making Cortez and Pizarro fabulously wealthy and powerful. But everybody else pretty much heard a myth. Cortez had come from a minor noble family, had university training as a lawyer, lower officer again. He was a brilliant leader, but ruthless, incredibly ambitious, apparently charismatic as well. That combination of traits is a formidable one if your goal is to be a powerful leader and you don't mind committing acts of violence to get what you want. And he didn't. He led, again, an unauthorized expedition, which he gambled and thought, even though I'm kind of, disobeying orders to do this, if I succeed and there is that fantastically wealthy empire and I take control of it and I send some of the wealth home to the king and queen of Spain, they're not going to care that I disobeyed orders, which is exactly what happened. He got the money, took down the empire, gave a big chunk of it to the king and queen of Spain, and they didn't care. So he gambled, and his gamble paid off for him. But he did this partly from stories that he'd heard from Native Americans that he had to, go and find out to know whether they were true or not. Epidemic disease is one of the explanations for Cortez's ability to take down a mighty empire, which had a military, a large number of warriors, an effective military. That's how they'd become an empire themselves. And partly answering the question, how did Cortez do this with several hundred troops only? Well, partly because the diseases preceded them. As we know, everywhere the Europeans landed in the Americas, not only did they bring diseases that Native Americans had no immunity to, it usually happened like immediately that outbreaks happened. So from like the first moment the Europeans landing in Virginia, Canada, so the French, etc., encountered Native Americans and talked with them or exchanged goods, it's like the diseases oftentimes sort of spread right then and there. Bentley again saying, during the siege of Tenochtitlan, when Cortez laid the capital city of the Aztecs under siege, smallpox raged through the city, killing inhabitants by the tens of thousands and fatally sapping the strength of defensive forces. Smallpox then rapidly spread beyond the capital, raced through Mexico, and carried off so many people that Aztec society was unable to function. Only in the context of this drastic depopulation is it possible to understand the Spanish conquest of Mexico. So it's quite possible, though we'll never know, but it's an interesting and useful what-if question to ask. What if smallpox hadn't broken out and debilitated the Aztecs, both militarily and otherwise, so drastically, so quickly? Would it have been a different story? Would Cortez have possibly failed? And I think, again, we have to speculate, but I think there's a real chance that could have been the case, since there were a lot fewer warriors and a lot sort of smaller of an economic apparatus, to put up defenses against the invading Spanish. There are a couple of other explanations here too. The fourth one has been mostly discredited, so we're going to just leave that one out for now, though it's still talked about a little bit, but I'm going to save time, not even talk about it. But the first, so we're explaining the conquest of not only the Aztecs, but the Incas that follows about 10 years later. So the Aztec conquest led by Cortez happened from 1519 to 1521. And the conquest of the Incan Empire between 1532 and 1533, led by Francisco Pizarro, comes then in basically Peru, Bolivia, etc. So the main explanations really sort of boil down to three main things. Again, the fourth one I'm skipping because it's been discredited for the most part. All three of these main explanations sort of are true of both the conquests of the Aztecs and the Incas. There are some differences too, but we're keeping this sort of at sort of the level of generality. If we get more specific, there are some differences we don't need to know about for our purposes here. So we already know the impact of disease. So when Pizarro got to Peru and got to the Incas and their neighbors, the diseases were already spreading like wildfire there as well. So huge advantage to the Europeans, though there is a mitigating factor that we'll learn about shortly as well. A second and also large explanation, numbers 1 and 2 are the biggest explanations of how the Spanish pulled this off when they were so short in numbers of troops, comparatively speaking. But the Spanish found willing Native American allies. This is where we get back to Donna Marina, because how did they find allies? Weren't the Native Americans, one group of Native Americans more likely to side with other fellow Native Americans than with the Spanish? No. And the reason is clear, and that is these empires, both the Aztec and the Incan Empire, were not turned into empires out of being nice to neighbors. They were done by conquest, by brutal, violent, bloody conquest. And so the neighbors had been brought under the control of the Aztecs, and then further to the south, the Incas, by actually the typical way that empires are carved out. One group comes in, and if they're stronger than you, they conquer you and make you part of their empire. And so this had been going on for a long time. And it's always true, almost always true, that when empires sort of do that to a subjugated people or people that become subjugated, guess what? There's lasting enmity. They don't like you. And sometimes generation after generation, they're biding their time and under their breath, plotting and planning to try to find a way to get you back and get out from under your leadership and rule. And this was true of the neighboring peoples around the Aztecs and also those around the Incas. So when Cortez came in, partly interpreted language interpretation done by Donna Marina, that basically said, hey, my plan is to go in and take out the Aztec Empire, utterly destroy it. You want to participate? Heck yeah, we do. We hate those guys. Right? They've been abusing us for a long, long time. Guess who did most of the grunt work to bring in the huge agricultural surplus? These were both agrarian empires, meaning their wealth was really based on huge amounts of agriculture. It was their conquered people, sometimes called the tributary peoples, the people that they had conquered, that did most of the grunt work. And the Aztecs are well known, you might already know this, for human sacrifice as part of their religious practice. Well, who do you think got sacrificed on their altars with their hearts ripped out while they were still alive? That's how it was usually done in front of people. They really believed that that was necessary to appease the gods. It wasn't just to be cruel, though it certainly was cruel. But it was mostly the tributary peoples or the conquered neighbors that were the sacrificial victims, of course. So there, I think you can see how and why their neighbors, though fellow Native Americans, didn't like the Aztecs so much and didn't like the Incas so much in their neck of the woods. The third explanation for how the Europeans, the Spanish, took down these two mighty, spectacular empires had to do with the weapons technology advantage, though it wasn't as great as it may sound. Gunpowder weapons, they had some guns and some cannons, but not very many. And they had steel-edged swords and crossbows and helmets and armor, which certainly did help them sort of defend against spears and arrows and bouncing off of them. But warfare in the locale and the geographical regions they were fighting in, high mountains oftentimes in Peru, the Incas, some of these things didn't give them much of an advantage, or as much as it might have other places, other times. Horses, they didn't have a lot of horses, but they had a little bit of an advantage there. The gunpowder weapons were wildly inaccurate, still fairly early in the history of guns used in warfare, and they didn't have that many of them, so they didn't kill thousands of people with guns, and it was more of a psychological advantage, since the native peoples had never experienced guns before. They were really loud, a lot of smoke sort of came out of them, and of course the projectile you can't even see, and if it hits somebody, they're laying on the ground with their guts spilling out like almost instantaneously. So there's probably a shock value to it, probably anywhere in the world where people first encountered guns, at least at the wrong end of them. But it's the first two explanations that I think are the big ones: the impact of disease and the ability to find willing Native American allies to fight against fellow Native Americans, against the Aztecs and Incas. So those same explanations also help us to understand how the impressive Inca Empire went down to defeat at the hands of a small Spanish force as well. And the Inca Empire was extremely impressive as well. If you look at the map in the upper left, the main empire is in the gold area there, kind of right in the middle, and the larger yellow areas around it are kind of the tributary people, or those that have been conquered. So the empire did include all those people. So the orange and the yellow combined is the empire, but the core land where the actual Incan people lived is in the middle. And they did sort of the same things, or conquered the group by force and sort of abused them, so that there was lots of anger and hatred from a number of directions, which Francisco Pizarro and his group of Spanish soldiers used against them. But they had sophisticated architecture, which you can see in a couple of the photos there, as sophisticated as anything you find in Europe at the same time, or other parts of the world. China, they had a spectacularly brilliant ceremonial culture with incredible different garments, the colors, and these festivals. that were impressive. So this, like the Aztecs, sort of bowled over the Europeans who were impressed by the empire, impressed by all the things they created, without it changing their minds about their racial views, which again is irrational, but racism is certainly irrational. In 1491, the Inca ruled the biggest empire on earth. One of our sources tells us bigger than the Ming dynasty in China, bigger by far than any European state. The empire encompassed every imaginable type of terrain. It was so large, so many different ecosystems. You can see there it's basically the whole of the west coast and even inland by hundreds of miles of South America. The Inca goal was to knit the scores of different groups in Western South America into a single bureaucratic framework under the direct rule of the emperor. So they were so ambitious, they were trying to take their empire even farther and sort of rule under one empire, under one government structure, the entirety of South America. They didn't make it, but they actually went pretty far. Their methods were audacious, brutal, and efficient. The biggest road system on the planet, among other things, was a result of this impressive empire. So it was impressive culturally, but it was also impressive politically and militarily, but that meant sort of brutal because it took that to subjugate and colonize all these neighboring fellow Native Americans. Pizarro had sort of the same motivation as Cortez, somewhat of a similar background. The son of a Spanish officer, but not from a big name family. Cortez has been from a minor noble family, but not a big high status one. Didn't have any formal schooling, unlike Cortez. Decided to try his luck, in Spanish colonization of the New World. So to many Spanish and Europeans, soldiers in particular, going to the Americas seemed like an opportunity, a way to move up in the world that you probably weren't going to get if you stayed home in Spain or Europe. He conquered the Incas with 180 Spanish soldiers, but as we know from the last slide, he had a lot of other help. So it was mainly Allied soldiers, Native Americans, that he got to fight alongside his 180 or so Spanish soldiers that made the difference. That plus the spread of disease and the more minor benefit of having gunpowder and steel as military technology. A ruthless brutality that might have shamed even Cortez, one current historian said, which is saying something indeed, because Cortez certainly possessed a ruthless brutality. Again, much of this sort of boils down to the same, explanations. In the case of the Incas, however, and Pizarro's conquest of them, they took the emperor for ransom as a hostage. In the Aztec Empire, Montezuma II, the last emperor of the Aztecs, was captured by Cortez at one point, but was sort of let out in his own recognizance because they were trying to recruit him as kind of a puppet ruler, saying, hey, go back and rule over your people, and because they trust you, but you'll be taking orders from us now, and this will benefit you if you do so. So Cortez was asking Montezuma to sell out his own people, and he let them out. Whether Montezuma ever planned to do it or not, he probably went along with it to get away. But things got so crazy with the Spanish around, people in the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan panicked. There was a sort of a civil war, and we don't know exactly how, but somewhere in that struggle, Montezuma was actually killed, apparently by his own people. They were increasingly frightened by this group that they'd never seen before, these pasty-skinned folks from some other part of the planet that were the Spanish, of course, and so he ended up dying. But in the case of Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire, they captured him and kept him and held him in ransom. And they made a deal, the Spanish leaders with Pizarro at the helm, and the sort of mover and shakers, the nobles, the elites of Incan culture, came to a deal. And the deal was, in the end, that if this room, the one you see right there, if that room were filled with treasure, gold and silver and trinkets and diamonds, whatever else was in the ground there that of a value, if they filled that to the brim with expensive, valuable stuff, then the Spanish said, "We'll let him go." And the room's specifications are there. The people did come and fill up the entire room, and the Spanish ended up taking the money and killing Atahalpa, the emperor, anyway. So they went back on their word, and the kind of things that got delivered were these sort of very ornate pieces of artwork made of solid gold, like the one you see in the lower left. But did the Spanish take that and put it sort of in a box carefully and take it back to a museum in Madrid, which would have still been stealing and pilfering? But no, what they did, you see on the right, they just immediately melted it down into gold to make coins. So they didn't give a fig about Inca culture. They didn't care about it at all. They wanted the loot. And you can see it in a direct, right in your face way by knowing this. It went from a beautiful, what would probably be today a priceless work of art, would be in it. Well, it is in a museum because that one did survive, but most of them did not. But they just wanted the money.